Hello, welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and I want to start today with a small thought experiment that I think captures the whole problem in one image. Imagine that every single time a smoke alarm went off in your house, you walked out the front door without ever checking whether there was a fire. The alarm shrieks, you leave, and the relief you feel on the porch is real. Now play that forward a few years. You'd never once have learned that almost every alarm was false, and slowly, quietly, the alarm itself would start running your life. That is more or less what anxiety does, and it's the paradox at the center of this episode. Avoidance works. That's the maddening part. You dodge the presentation or the phone call or the crowded room, and your anxiety drops almost immediately, and some deep part of your brain files that away as a win. The trouble is that the very thing that makes you feel better today is often the thing that makes anxiety stronger tomorrow. So here's the stride we're walking. I want to answer one question that ties everything together. If anxiety is your brain's prediction that something bad might happen, why does escaping the situation convince your brain that it was right to be afraid in the first place? We'll move through 5 stops to get there. Why your brain mistakes avoidance for good problem solving. Why escaping stops your brain from ever correcting a false alarm. What actually changes inside the brain when you avoid a fear versus when you face it safely. Why anxiety has this tendency to spread and shrink your world. And finally, what modern neuroscience says about how to turn all of it around. There's a bonus stop near the end, too, about whether anxiety is really about fear at all or about something quieter and more slippery. Let's take the first step. Here's the first thing worth understanding because it explains why avoidance is so hard to resist. When you escape something you're afraid of, your brain doesn't just feel the absence of fear, it gets an actual reward. Researchers have found that the relief you feel when an expected threat fails to arrive registers in the brain, much like winning money does, showing up in behavior, in what people say they feel, and even in the body's physiology. So, relief is not a neutral thing, a simple return to baseline. It's a little hit of pleasure, and your brain treats it as proof that whatever you just did was smart. Psychologists call this negative reinforcement, which is a slightly confusing term, so let me unpack it. It doesn't mean punishment, it means a behavior gets strengthened because it removes something unpleasant. The escape takes away the distress, the removal feels great, and so the escape gets stamped in as a strategy worth repeating. And there's a cruel twist for anxious brains specifically. Studies show that people with anxiety disorders tend to feel even more relief after successfully avoiding something, which means the reward is larger, which means the lesson lands harder. The more anxious you are, the more powerfully your brain learns to avoid. Now, connect that to how the brain learns in the first place, because this is where it gets interesting. Your brain is a prediction machine. If you've followed this series, you've heard me say that about dopamine and about loneliness. And it turns out fear runs on the same engine. The brain constantly predicts what's about to happen and then updates itself when reality disagrees, using a mismatch signal that researchers call prediction error. When a threat you expected simply does not occur, that gap is exactly the teaching moment where your brain is supposed to learn, oh, that was safe after all. There's even evidence that dopamine fires at the moment a feared shock is omitted, helping to write that safety lesson into memory. Here's the problem. Avoidance robs your brain of that lesson, and it does something sneakier on top of it. When you escape and nothing bad happens, your brain doesn't conclude the situation was safe. It concludes, I was saved because I left. The safety gets credited to the escape rather than to the situation, so the underlying belief that the thing was dangerous survives completely intact. You didn't disprove the alarm, you just got good at running from it. And the more you run, the more automatic it becomes, until repeated avoidance stops being a deliberate choice at all and shifts into something closer to a reflex. Brain research suggests this even migrates across circuits over time, moving from the flexible, goal-directed parts of the brain toward the habit machinery, which is part of why long-standing avoidance can feel so stubbornly out of your control. I want to pause here because if you're someone who avoids, I don't want you hearing your brain is broken or you're doing it wrong. You're not. A brain that reduces your distress and then repeats what worked is a brain doing its job beautifully. The catch is that it optimized for the wrong thing, for feeling better right now instead of learning something true. Naming that isn't a criticism, it's the first loosened bolt. That brings us to our second stop, which sharpens the whole picture. To understand why anxiety sticks around for years, you have to understand a simple, almost unfair rule about how fear gets corrected. Your brain can only update the belief that something is dangerous if you stay in contact with the feared thing long enough for the predicted harm to not happen. The correction requires presence. If you leave early, the prediction, this is dangerous, is never cleanly contradicted, so there's nothing for the brain to revise. Researchers describe avoidance as protecting the fear from extinction, and I find that phrasing quietly devastating. Extinction is the technical word for the new learning that lets fear fade, and avoidance shields the old fear from ever being challenged by it. In predictive terms, the anxious brain is holding a strong prior, a confident expectation that danger is coming, and the only thing that can soften that prior is direct evidence to the contrary. Avoidance removes the evidence, so the prior stays sharp, certain, and self confirming, not because the world keeps proving it right, but because you keep leaving before the world can prove it wrong. There's a detail here that overturns a common assumption, and it deserves a spotlight. You might think anxious people simply acquire fear more easily, that their alarm is quicker to install, but the research points somewhere more specific. Higher anxiety is linked less to learning fear faster and more to learning safety slower. The anxious brain has a harder time absorbing the lesson that something is okay now, even when the evidence is right in front of it. That reframe matters enormously because it means the target of recovery isn't really turning the fear down. It's helping the brain finally take in the safety it keeps missing. So we've established that avoidance feels rewarding and that it blocks correction. Our third stop goes underneath the behavior, into the brain itself, because anxiety isn't stored in one spot like a file. It's a conversation among several brain regions, and avoidance changes what they say to each other. Three players matter most here. There's the amygdala, the brain's threat detector and alarm bell. There's the hippocampus, which handles context, the where and when of a memory. And there's a region at the front called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which you can think of as the brain's voice of calm, the part that can say, I know this looks scary, but we're safe here. When you face a fear safely, something genuinely hopeful happens in that conversation, and it's more subtle than people expect. Exposure does not erase the original fear memory. Instead, the brain builds a second, competing memory, a safety memory, and lays it right alongside the fear. That calm prefrontal region strengthens its ability to inhibit the amygdala's alarm, and the hippocampus tags the new learning with context. What that means is that recovery is less like deleting a bad file and more like writing a stronger, newer note that says safe and learning to reach for it first. This is one of the most robust findings in the field, and I think it's oddly reassuring. You don't have to destroy your fear, you have to outpractice it. It also explains something that frustrates and confuses people, which is why fear can come roaring back even after you thought you'd beaten it. Because the old memory was never deleted, only outcompeted, it can resurface when the context changes, a phenomenon researchers call renewal. Face your fear successfully in the therapist's office, then meet it in a parking garage at night, and the hippocampus may fail to apply the safety lesson to the new setting. This is not failure or backsliding in the way it feels. It's the predictable behavior of a brain that files safety as context dependent, and it points straight at how good treatment has to work, which we'll get to. Avoidance, by contrast, simply never lets that safety memory get built in the first place. So the fear expressing circuits stay dominant, unchallenged, running the show. Now to our fourth stop, and this one names something a lot of people have lived without having a word for. Anxiety spreads. It rarely stays politely contained to the one thing that started it. One bad experience in an elevator becomes a wariness of all elevators. One panic attack while driving becomes avoiding the highway, then the car, then leaving town. Psychologists call this generalization, and it's how a single fear can slowly expand until a person's world gets smaller and smaller. The mechanism is fascinating and a little counterintuitive. A single frightening event can make anything resembling the original threat feel dangerous too. And in anxiety, this spreading is broader than usual. In generalized anxiety in particular, researchers find what they call a shallow gradient, meaning fear fades too slowly as situations become less and less like the original scare, so even distant, barely related cues still ping the alarm. But here's the newer and more surprising piece. A big part of the spread may not be overgeneralizing fear at all. It may be failing to generalize safety. Some studies find that highly anxious people aren't necessarily worse at spreading danger from a threat cue. They're worse at extending safety from a safe one. Their brain struggles to conclude this new thing is like the safe thing, so novelty tips toward threat by default. Underneath this is a memory process with a wonderful name, pattern separation, the brain's ability to keep similar experiences distinct. When that ability weakens, similar situations blur together, and a partial resemblance can trigger what's called pattern completion, where a fragment of a cue reactivates an entire threat memory. A whiff of the elevator's stale air, a certain fluorescent flicker, and the whole fear floods back as if you were in the original moment, and avoidance pours concrete around all of it, because the more situations you avoid, the fewer chances your brain gets to discover that any of them were safe. The expanding definition of danger never gets corrected, so it just keeps expanding. I know that stretch can feel heavy, like a description of a trap with no exit. So let me turn us firmly toward our fifth stop, which is the whole reason this science matters. Because the same research that maps how avoidance strengthens fear also tells us in real detail how to reverse it. And the reversal has a name most people have heard: exposure. Though what modern neuroscience says about exposure is smarter than the old just face your fears until you calm down version. The old idea was that you white knuckle it until your anxiety drops in the moment, that the goal is to get comfortable. The field has moved on from that. The goal now is not to reduce fear during the session, but to create new learning and specifically to violate a prediction. The magic ingredient is surprise. Exposure works best when you go in with a concrete, scary expectation, something like, if I speak up in this meeting, people will laugh at me. And then you stay long enough to discover viscerally that the predicted catastrophe did not happen. That mismatch, that expectancy violation, is the prediction error that finally teaches the brain something new. And research finds this approach outperforms simply waiting for anxiety to fade. There's even evidence that early activity in that calm prefrontal region during this kind of learning predicts who benefits most from therapy later. A few refinements make that learning stick, and they follow directly from everything we've covered. You have to drop the safety behaviors, the little crutches like gripping a water bottle or over rehearsing or keeping one hand on the exit, because if you escape distress that way, your brain credits the crutch instead of learning the situation was fine. You have to practice across many contexts rather than one, so the safety memory doesn't stay locked to a single room, which is the direct answer to that renewal problem we talked about. And maybe most importantly, good exposure trains a tolerance for not knowing rather than promising certainty, because as we're about to see, the real enemy is often uncertainty itself. Researchers frame the whole endeavor beautifully. You're not trying to silence the alarm. You're engineering moments of surprising safety, then making that lesson portable enough to carry into the rest of your life. I do want to say something responsible here before we go further. Exposure is powerful, and it is also something that works best with the guidance of a trained therapist, especially for anxiety that's genuinely interfering with your life. This episode is a map of the terrain, not a substitute for a guide. If your world has been shrinking, please consider reaching out to a professional who does this work, because the science we're describing is most effective when it's done skillfully and with support. That leads into the bonus stop I promised, the one that reframes the whole thing, and it's my favorite. Notice a thread running through so many anxious moments. It often isn't the feared event that torments people most, it's the not knowing. I don't know if they'll reject me. I don't know if this weird chest feeling is serious. I don't know if I'll panic. The dread lives in the question mark, and this has led a lot of researchers to argue that anxiety may be less a disorder of fear and more a disorder of uncertainty. There's real weight behind this. A trait researchers call intolerance of uncertainty, essentially how unbearable you find not knowing, shows a solid association with anxiety symptoms across a huge body of studies, and it cuts across many different diagnoses rather than belonging to just one. Fear, in the classic sense, tends to be about a present and defined threat. Anxiety is future tilted, and it feeds on incomplete information. One way to understand the anxious brain is that it estimates the world as more volatile and unpredictable than it is, keeps its threat predictions cranked high, and treats constant vigilance as the only sensible response to a world it can't pin down. A lot of anxious behavior, when you look closely, isn't aimed at eliminating actual danger. It's aimed at eliminating the discomfort of uncertainty, at restoring a feeling of control. I'll keep my footing here, the way I try to in every episode, because the science does not say anxiety is only about uncertainty. Fear circuitry, learned threat associations, and the specifics of each condition all still matter. Uncertainty seems to be a major organizing theme rather than the entire story. But even as a partial truth, it's a clarifying one because it reframes the goal. If a big part of anxiety is the brain refusing to tolerate an open question, then recovery isn't about finally getting certainty, which life rarely offers anyway. It's about slowly building the capacity to sit with not knowing and be okay. And that, notice, is exactly what facing a fear without escaping actually trains. So let me bring the whole stride home. We started with a smoke alarm and a simple, uncomfortable truth. Every time you leave the building without checking, you teach yourself the alarm was right. Avoidance feels like problem solving because relief is a genuine reward, but it credits the escape instead of the situation, so the false belief survives. It blocks the only thing that corrects fear, which is staying present long enough to be surprised by safety. It leaves the brain's fear circuits dominant and its calm circuits underpracticed. It spreads as the brain fails to carry safety into new situations, and the definition of danger quietly grows. And underneath much of it sits a brain that simply cannot stand not knowing. But every one of those mechanisms runs in reverse. The same brain that learned avoidance saved me can learn I was safe all along. One surprising, prediction violating, stayed with moment at a time. Recovery does not come from silencing the alarm or from finally achieving certainty. It comes from staying in the room long enough to discover, again and again, and in enough different rooms, that you are safe and that you can bear not knowing for sure. Here's what I hope you carry out of this one. If your world has been getting smaller, that shrinking is not proof that the world is dangerous. It's the predictable footprint of a brain doing exactly what avoidance trains it to do, and it can be untrained, gently, with support, through small acts of approach where you'd normally flee. Every time you stay, you hand your brain the one piece of evidence it's been missing. That's the stride from escaping fear toward a solution you can actually use. Thanks for walking it with me. I'm Esther Adams. This has been Strides to Solutions, and I'll see you next time.